I never imagined that dropping a single quarter into the palm of an old man at a dusty county auction would change the entire course of my life. At first it felt like a joke. A beat-up little cabin on a forgotten patch of land, listed on the docket for starting bid, 25 cents. People in the room had laughed, some rolled their eyes, and a few whispered that the auctioneer must have made a mistake. But when no one else raised a hand, I figured, why not? It was 25 cents, less than the cost of a gumball at a gas station. The gavel slammed down, and just like that, I was the owner of a dilapidated cabin in the middle of nowhere. I didn't even know exactly where it was. The paperwork was thin, just a deed with coordinates scrawled across the top, and the clerk handed it to me like it was nothing more than a receipt for chewing gum. I tossed it on the passenger seat of my old truck and didn't think much of it. That first drive out to the property nearly made me regret the decision. The road was more like a forgotten trail, lined with trees that clawed at the side of my truck, and when I finally found the cabin, it looked like it hadn't been lived in since the early 1900s. The roof sagged like a tired old man's shoulders. The porch groaned when I stepped onto it, and the front door hung on one hinge. Inside, cobwebs draped the corners, and the smell of mildew hit me like a wall. Broken furniture littered the rooms, windows were cracked, and the place looked ready to collapse at the first strong wind. But something about it hooked me. Maybe it was the quiet, the untouched forest surrounding it, or the sense that this cabin had stories buried deep in its bones. I decided to treat it like a project. After all, what did I have to lose except the quarter I had already forgotten about? Spending. At first, it was just weekend trips, hauling out trash, patching leaks, hammering new boards where the old ones had rotted through. Neighbors, though neighbors is generous since the closest house was miles away, would occasionally drive by and watch, but no one stopped to talk. For months I worked in solitude, treating the cabin like an escape from my 9-to-5 life back in the city. Then something strange happened. While tearing down a warped wall panel, I discovered a hidden compartment stuffed with old papers, survey maps, and letters that dated back nearly a century. Some were deeds, others were mineral rights contracts, and a few bore official seals from the county recorder's office. Most people might have dismissed them as junk, but I took them to a lawyer friend who nearly fell out of his chair. Apparently, my 25-cent purchase included more than just the shack. It covered hundreds of acres of land that had never been properly parceled or taxed because of clerical errors and forgotten records. Hidden beneath the legal jargon was the fact that I owned an enormous chunk of undeveloped wilderness, sitting right on the edge of an expanding town. Developers were already sniffing around the area, paying millions for properties half the size. Overnight, my crumbling cabin became the front door to land worth more than I could wrap my head around. At first I kept quiet. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, and besides, I still couldn't quite believe it was real. But word spreads fast in small towns, and soon cars began slowing down whenever they passed the cabin. People who had never cared before suddenly wanted to know who I was, what my plans were, whether I intended to sell. Some came with smiles and handshakes, others with questions wrapped in suspicion. The strangest of them all were the representatives from the local homeowners association. I laughed when the first letter arrived in my mailbox. It was printed on official letterhead, stamped with an HOA logo I had never seen before, and it demanded that I pay dues for shared community services. The kicker? My land wasn't even inside their neighborhood. I brushed it off as a mistake, tossed the letter into a drawer, and went back to sanding floorboards. But the letters kept coming, and soon they turned from polite requests into threats of fines. According to them, my cabin was now considered part of their community jurisdiction. The wording was slippery, full of legal jargon that made my head spin, but the gist was clear. They were trying to rope me into their grasp. By then, the value of my land had skyrocketed. A year after buying it, appraisers put the property's worth at nearly $10 million. Offers poured in from developers, each one higher than the last, but I refused to sell. I had fallen in love with the cabin and the wild land around it, and I wanted to preserve it, not bulldoze it into another cookie-cutter subdivision. That decision made me a target. The HOA escalated quickly, sending representatives to my property, sometimes unannounced. One afternoon, I came back from the hardware store to find a woman in a blazer snapping photos of my cabin, jotting notes onto a clipboard. When I asked what she was doing, she didn't answer, just smirked and walked back to her car. Weeks later, I noticed survey stakes hammered into the ground near my driveway, bright orange flags fluttering in the breeze. Someone had marked boundaries that didn't match my deed, slicing pieces of my land into what they claimed were common areas. It was like watching a slow-motion theft unfold in front of me, and I realized this wasn't going to stop on its own. I hired a lawyer, the same friend who had confirmed my good fortune in the first place. He laughed when I showed him the HOA letters, but the laughter quickly faded as he dug deeper. The association had a reputation for overstepping its authority, bullying residents and bending rules until they snapped. They had money, power, and connections at City Hall. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became. They weren't just testing me. They were laying the groundwork to seize my property outright. Their strategy was simple. Claim my land fell under their jurisdiction, rack up fake fines until I couldn't pay, then foreclose and snatch it from me for pennies. It sounded absurd, but cases like this had happened before, and the HOA usually won. The thought of losing everything over a technicality gnawed at me. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning as I imagined strangers fencing off my land, bulldozers tearing down the cabin I had poured my sweat into. Every creak in the woods outside made me paranoid. Every set of headlights on the road made me wonder if another HOA representative was lurking nearby. Still, I refused to back down. This was my land, my cabin, and I wasn't about to let a pack of clipboard-wielding bullies steal it. But the HOA wasn't slowing down either. They ramped up their pressure, filing official complaints with the county, demanding inspections, and even petitioning to have my property rezoned. The final straw came when I received a certified letter claiming that the cabin and its surrounding acres had been erroneously sold and technically belonged to the HOA all along. They demanded I vacate the premises within 30 days. Stared at the paper in disbelief, my hands shaking. It was no longer just harassment. They were trying to erase my ownership completely. My lawyer warned me that the fight ahead would be ugly, expensive, and exhausting. But I had no choice. I wasn't about to walk away from a $10 million property, let alone the home I had come to love. What started as a quarters gamble had turned into the battle of my life, and the first shots had just been fired. And that was when things got truly dangerous, because the HOA wasn't just sending letters anymore. They were about to show up on my doorstep in ways I never could have imagined. The day after that certified letter arrived, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling somewhere in the distance. At first, I thought it was a logging crew working on the other side of the woods, but as I stepped out onto the porch, I realized the noise was coming from the dirt road leading up to my cabin. A flatbed truck rolled slowly toward me, carrying a portable office trailer, followed by a pickup painted with the HOA's logo on its doors. Men in neon vests hopped out, hammering signs into the ground that read, "Community Project, No Trespassing." My own property was being treated like construction land, as if I didn't even exist. I ran back inside for my deed, double-checked the boundaries, and felt my chest tighten. They had parked the trailer right on my land, just past the tree line, and were acting as though it belonged to them. It was a brazen move, the kind you don't expect unless someone feels untouchable. I called my lawyer, who told me not to confront them directly, but the damage had already been done. By the end of the day, strangers in polo shirts and khakis were walking around with clipboards, taking measurements, and planting stakes. To the outside eye, it looked official, but to me, it was a hostile invasion. For the first time, the peace and solitude of the cabin felt shattered, like my sanctuary had been pierced by something cold and calculated. Over the next week, the harassment grew worse. Notices appeared taped to my cabin door, each one bolder than the last, claiming I owed thousands of dollars in unpaid HOA dues. According to them, the debt had accrued retroactively from the moment I bought the cabin. Every piece of paper threatened liens, foreclosures, and lawsuits, their wording carefully designed to intimidate. My lawyer sent formal responses disputing everything, but it didn't matter. They weren't playing by the rules. They were playing to wear me down. I started noticing cars idling on the road at odd hours, their headlights cutting through the trees. Sometimes they'd linger for half an hour, engines humming, before driving away. Once I caught a man crouching near my fence line, snapping pictures of my cabin with a telephoto lens. When I shouted from the porch, he darted back into the woods and disappeared. It was clear they were building a case, fabricating whatever, evidence they thought might stick. Sleep became scarce. Every crack of a branch outside jolted me awake. Every distant rumble of an engine set my nerves on edge. What had once been a place of peace now felt like a siege. And through it all, offers to buy my land kept arriving, each one from companies with vague names that traced back, suspiciously, to people connected with the HOA board. They were trying to scare me into selling, to make the fight seem more trouble than it was worth. But the more pressure they applied, the more determined I became to hold on. If they wanted me to break, they underestimated just how stubborn I could be. My lawyer filed counterclaims, demanding the county recognize my deed and dismiss the HOA's false assertions. We thought we'd finally made some progress when a court date was scheduled, but the HOA had other tricks up their sleeves. A week. Before the hearing, county inspectors showed up at my property, claiming they had received numerous complaints about unsafe conditions. They marched through the cabin with clipboards, noting every loose board, every uneven step, every minor imperfection that could be exaggerated into a violation. By the end of their inspection, I had been cited for dozens of supposed code violations, each carrying fines that added up to tens of thousands of dollars. It was a coordinated attack designed to bury me under paperwork and fees until I had no choice but to surrender. My lawyer warned me that this was exactly how the HOA operated, death by 1,000 cuts. It wasn't about being right. It was about making resistance more expensive than compliance. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, something unexpected happened. Local news picked up on the story. A small-town reporter who had been covering shady HOA practices for years came across my case and decided to feature it. The article painted me as the underdog fighting against a greedy organization, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. Emails started arriving from strangers across the state, people who had fought similar battles and lost everything. Some warned me to settle while I still could. Others encouraged me to keep fighting no matter the cost. The attention didn't sit well with the HOA. Within days of the article's release, their representatives were back on my property, this time with county deputies in tow. They claimed I was trespassing on community land and tried to have me removed from my own cabin. The deputies looked uncomfortable, flipping through paperwork that contradicted itself, but in the end, they left without forcing me out. The message was clear, though. The HOA was willing to use law enforcement as a weapon, bending the truth until it snapped. Fear began creeping into every corner of my life. I started keeping a journal of everything that happened, documenting every visit, every letter, every unexplained car that lingered on the road. My lawyer told me the evidence could be crucial if the case dragged on, but for me, it was also a way to keep myself sane, to remind myself I wasn't imagining the harassment. The breaking point came one evening as the sun dipped behind the trees. I returned from town to find the cabin's front door wide open, swinging in the breeze. Inside, drawers had been pulled out, papers scattered across the floor, and furniture overturned. Nothing valuable was missing, but the intent was obvious. It was a message, a warning that they could reach me anytime they wanted. I called the sheriff's office, but the deputy who showed up seemed more annoyed than concerned. He scribbled a few notes, shrugged, and left, offering no real help. My lawyer suspected the HOA had connections even within law enforcement. Strings they could pull to make sure complaints like mine went nowhere. That night I sat in the dark with a shotgun across my lap, every creak of the old cabin echoing like a threat. I wasn't just fighting for land anymore. I was fighting for my safety, for my right to exist without being bullied out of what I rightfully owned. As the weeks dragged on, the court case finally inched closer. My lawyer prepared mountains of paperwork, each page proving that my deed was legitimate, that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property. But the closer we got to the hearing, the more desperate their tactics became. Anonymous letters appeared in my mailbox, threatening me if I didn't cooperate. My tires were slashed twice, always the night before important meetings. Once, I came outside to find dead animals left at the edge of my driveway, a grotesque intimidation tactic meant to rattle me. It worked. My hands shook as I cleaned up the mess, wondering just how far they were willing to go. The pressure built until the court date finally arrived. I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer by my side, clutching my folder of evidence like it was a lifeline. Across the aisle sat the HOA's attorneys, a polished team of suits who smirked as though they had already won. Their argument was simple but dangerous: that the cabin had been sold in error, that the land had always been designated as community property, and that I was nothing more than a squatter on land that belonged to them. My lawyer countered with the deed, the county records, and the mountain of evidence proving otherwise. For hours, the judge listened, flipping through documents, occasionally frowning as though trying to untangle a knot no one else could see. When the hearing ended, the judge announced that a ruling would be delivered in writing within 30 days. 30 days. A month of waiting while the HOA continued to tighten its grip. A month where anything could happen. And it did. The very next week, survey crews returned, this time accompanied by private security guards who patrolled the edge of my property like they owned it. The message was undeniable. They weren't going to wait for a ruling. They were going to take what they wanted, whether the court allowed it or not. And as I stood on the porch watching strangers patrol my land, a cold realization sank in. This fight wasn't just about deeds or paperwork anymore. It was about power, intimidation, and who could endure the longest. The HOA was escalating beyond bureaucracy, and I knew in my gut that the next move they made would be even more dangerous. Because when organizations like that feel cornered, they don't back down. They strike. The waiting period after the hearing felt like living in limbo, suspended between two realities. On one side was the life I had built with sweat and stubbornness, my cabin standing as proof of what a single quarter could become. On the other side was the looming shadow of the HOA, circling like vultures, waiting for the moment they could swoop in and strip it all away. Each day blurred into the next, filled with the constant hum of unease. I started waking up before dawn, checking the edges of my land for intruders, scanning the tree line for movement. Sleep had become a luxury, one I could rarely afford. The survey crews returned again and again, their bright vests flashing through the woods like warning lights. They hammered fresh stakes into the soil, ignoring my protests, their smug faces telling me that they believed the land was already theirs. Behind them, private security lingered, men with crossed arms and mirrored sunglasses who watched me like a problem waiting to be solved. It wasn't just intimidation anymore, it was occupation. My lawyer filed urgent complaints, demanding the court enforce my rights while the ruling was still pending, but the bureaucracy moved at a glacial pace. Every time I opened my mailbox, there was another letter. Fines, threats, or offers to buy me out for a fraction of what the property was worth. Each piece of paper felt like a taunt, daring me to give in. But the real escalation came one stormy night. The rain poured in sheets, hammering the cabin roof as thunder rolled across the valley. In the middle of the downpour, the power went out. At first, I thought it was just the storm, but when I checked the breaker box, I found the wires had been deliberately cut. Panic surged through me as I realized this wasn't an accident. Alone in the dark, I lit a lantern and sat in silence, listening. That's when I heard it, the distant growl of engines, followed by the crunch of tires on wet gravel. Headlights pierced through the trees, too many to be a coincidence. Vehicles lined up along the road, and figures stepped out, their flashlights sweeping across the property. They didn't approach directly, but they didn't leave either. They stood at the edge of the woods, watching, waiting, their presence, heavy and hostile. It was psychological warfare, designed to break me down. By morning, they were gone, but the damage was done. My nerves were frayed, and the isolation of the cabin no longer felt like freedom. It felt like a trap. I considered leaving, even if just temporarily, but a stubborn part of me refused. If I left, I feared I'd return to find the cabin bulldozed and the land fenced off, my claim erased in my absence. Then, just when I thought I had endured the worst, the smear campaign began. Flyers appeared around town with my face plastered on them, accusing me of being a squatter, a thief who had stolen land that didn't belong to me. Anonymous posts flooded local forums, twisting the truth, painting me as a greedy outsider standing in the way of community progress. It worked. When I drove into town for supplies, I felt the stares, cold and hostile. Conversations hushed. When I walked into the diner, people who once waved now turned away. The HOA had poisoned the well, turning the community against me. It was a crushing weight, to be painted as the villain in a story where I was simply trying to hold on to what was mine. But through all the noise I clung to one thought: the ruling. The judge's decision was the one thing that could cut through the lies and intimidation. When the letter finally arrived, my hands trembled as I tore it open. The ruling confirmed what I had known all along. The cabin and land were legally mine, the deed valid and binding. The HOA had no jurisdiction, no authority, no claim. For the first time in months, relief washed over me. But that relief didn't last long. Victory on paper was one thing. Enforcing it against an organization that had already shown it played by its own rules was another. And as I soon learned, the HOA wasn't about to let go quietly. The ruling should have been the end of it, but instead, it was the spark that set off the final confrontation. The day after the decision became public, the HOA's office trailer vanished from my property, but in its place came something worse. Dozens of protesters lined the road, waving signs that accused me of theft and betrayal. They chanted loudly, blocking the driveway, preventing deliveries and visitors. Some claimed to be local homeowners. Others I didn't recognize at all. But their anger was real, fueled by the lies the HOA had spread. They weren't just targeting me. They were trying to make me a pariah. The harassment reached a fever pitch. Rocks shattered my cabin windows in the dead of night, and graffiti smeared across the porch called me a fraud. My truck tires were slashed again, and strange vehicles prowled the road at all hours. My lawyer advised calling the sheriff, but by now I knew better. The sheriff's office wasn't going to help me. If anything, some deputies might have been, on the HOA's side. That's when I realized this fight wasn't going to be won with paperwork alone. If I wanted to keep my land, I had to take control of the story. The same local reporter who had first covered my case agreed to meet with me. I handed over every piece of documentation I had gathered: photos, videos, copies of letters, even recordings of the harassment. When her new report aired, it exposed everything: the intimidation tactics, the false claims, the cut power lines, the smear campaign. The story spread far beyond the town, picked up by larger outlets hungry for a David versus Goliath drama. Suddenly, the public opinion shifted. Strangers who had once scowled now offered words of support. Donations poured in for my legal battle. The HOA, once so confident, began scrambling to control the narrative. Their board members issued statements denying everything, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Their carefully constructed image cracked under the weight of exposure. Lawsuits began piling up against them, not from me, but from other homeowners who finally felt brave enough to come forward. The HOA's power was unraveling, thread by thread. Still, the damage to me was real. The cabin bore scars from months of siege, the land littered with the remnants of their incursions. I was exhausted, worn down by the constant stress, but I was still standing. And in that, there was victory. When the final settlement came, it wasn't just recognition of my ownership. It was a blow to the HOA's entire operation. Fines, resignations, investigations. The organization that had once seemed untouchable was now in shambles. I should have felt triumphant, but what I felt was something different. Relief. Relief that it was finally over, that I could sit on my porch without fear of headlights in the dark, that I could hear the wind in the trees without wondering if it carried footsteps. The cabin, once just a gamble worth a quarter, had become a fortress of resilience, a reminder of what I had endured. Its value, measured in millions of dollars, meant less to me now than the fact that it was mine, unchallenged, and secure. In the end, I hadn't just kept my land. I had exposed the rot that festered beneath the surface of power and control. I had stood against the storm and weathered it, scarred but unbroken, and as the sun set behind the ridge, painting the sky in shades of fire, I realized the real worth of the cabin wasn't in dollars or deeds, but in the lesson it had carved into my bones. Sometimes the smallest gamble can lead to the biggest battles, and sometimes the fight itself is what makes the victory priceless.